What a great, exciting evening this is, and thanks to everyone who braved the cold and the snow to come out, Bill especially, for that hairy drive down through New Hampshire. This is a real privilege, and for those of you who saw the advertising for tonight, you will know that we have, we organized this as a pre-buttal to the State of the Union, which is coming up pretty soon. And rather than the commonplace that presidents start their State of the Union messages with, in which they say the state of our union is strong, we think the state of our union is wrong. And I know that 350.org is planning watch parties on the 31st to respond to Trump. Bernie Sanders is going to be there, Reverend Yearwood, you, of course, and others. And I'm wondering if we could just start by having you describe the State of the Union and what is your rebuttal to the president?
Well, first of all, let me just say it's a great pleasure to be in Massachusetts and in Boston and in Jamaica Plain and in this beautiful church. I spoke here once before, but that time they let me speak up in the pulpit, and I actually kind of enjoyed being 10 feet above contradiction up there, you know. It was a nice feeling. Look, you know, one of the prerequisites of, you know, writing about and thinking about climate change all the time is that one can be gloomy all the time. And there is plenty to be gloomy about. The state of the planet is pretty parlous right now. I mean, you all watched in the course of 40 days or so last fall when we had the biggest rainstorm in the history of the United States with Hurricane Harvey, and the longest stretch of wind above 185 miles an hour ever recorded on the planet with Hurricane Irma. Then Hurricane Maria, you know, rare that you have a Category 5 hurricane just plow across the middle of a developed place and just lay it to waste. And by the way, nobody forget for a second what is going on there. We're 100 days out from that hurricane making landfall, and there's still half the island without power. Imagine what it would be like in Massachusetts if you had 100 days without electricity. What the kind of, well, imagine among other things, just how angry and crazy everybody would be. You know, to top that off, we went straight to California and had two of the worst forest fires ever recorded. The second one, the biggest fire in California history, coming in December, 2 months after when forest fire season is supposed to end in California in the West. And then, of course, immediately on the heels of that, we had epic rainfall in exactly the same place in California, producing the kind of mudslides that we're used to seeing pictures of in Bolivia or, you know, Peru or someplace, but not in Montecito, you know, not in affluent parts of the United States. It's as if, I don't know whether God is just as annoyed about President Trump as the rest of us, or if he's doing what she can to, you know, try and demonstrate the folly of where we are. We're in a tough place right now, and obviously politically it didn't get any easier last year. We spent the whole year dismantling in a matter of months the environmental rules and regulations that people had worked hard for 30 and 40 years to put in place. And to sort of top it off, we withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, the nation that had put more carbon in the atmosphere than anybody else, the only nation on earth, even the government of Syria in October managed to sign on to the Paris Climate Accords. We're the only ones not playing in this. So, in one sense, things couldn't be much worse. But in another, and maybe we should get to this rather quickly, In another, things are, I think 2018 is going to be a year of rebound in many ways, that the resistance that began to blossom and coalesce last year is ready to stop playing defense and start playing offense, and that's what we're working really hard at 350 and a lot of other places right now, and there's some good signs already this year.
I just had a request about maybe, how would you feel about standing? I guess people in the back can't.
Can I go back up in the pulpit?
Yes.
I'll stand up. No, you want us to go back up?
Why not? You can, people can see you.
All right.
I'll hand the mic up to you.
The Trump administration and Republicans have been attempting to thwart progress on climate change since they've come in, but they've been met with opposition at almost every turn, in the streets, in the courts, in the states, and the cities. How are we doing? Has the resistance been up to the task? Do you see us losing or gaining ground, or, as you put it recently in a really important article, are we losing by winning slowly?
So that's the danger, of course, is that even if we organize, if we don't move fast, we won't catch up with the physics. This is the first time-limited problem that humans have ever kind of run into, and that's the part that scares me the most. It's not that we won't win eventually, it's that we won't win quickly enough to matter. 100 years from now, we're going to be powered by solar panels and windmills. The question is, will the world that's powered by solar panels and windmills be essentially a broken planet? And that's what it will be if we don't make that transition very, very quickly before huge damage is done. We're clearly not going to win anything in Washington anytime soon, right? I mean, even if we win the elections in 2018, which we darn well better, because that'll make playing defense much, much easier and more effective, we're not in a position in Washington that we're going to pass some kind of good sweeping laws anytime soon that deal with this problem. That's just not in the cards, which means that we've got to be exceptionally good at doing things in the places where we can. The action has now moved to, in this country, to states and cities and towns. And in particular, we desperately need the places, the states and cities and towns in kind of blue parts of the country showing up and really getting things done. So the year's off to a good start in that regard, I will say. Can I tell a story about this New York stuff? Is that okay?
That was my next question.
Okay, good. Well, then for you can ask the question then, and then I don't mean to.
On January 10th, you were present in New York City for the announcement of a major development, the city's pension fund divestment and lawsuit against Big Oil.
So, this is okay.
Bill's going to tell us about the Empire State Building, but at that time you said, quote, "This means the tide is finally turning in the climate fight." Tell us about why you think that and why this is so important.
So, first of all, this is a great example of grassroots organizing of the kind that 350 Massachusetts does so well, and which we're so grateful to Craig and to you and everybody else for doing. People at 350 NYC and 350 Brooklyn and whatever had been pushing for a long time to get the city of New York to divest its pension funds from fossil fuel. This is the one of the 20 biggest pools of money on earth, the New York City retirement funds. It's roughly $200 billion, so serious money. So 2 weeks ago, Sunday night, I was just sitting at home in Vermont, and the phone rang, and it was Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, saying, we're going to do it. We're going to divest. Not only are we going to divest, we're going to sue the oil companies as well for the damages that have happened at places like Hurricane Sandy. So this is a big deal for many reasons. The divestment fight in general is a big deal, and it's been going. It's 5 years old now, and it's turned into the largest thing of its kind ever, and it's been going extraordinarily well. And I just noticed him down front, so I want to pay real homage to one person in particular. who, when we started this divestment fight, was the absolute invaluable advisor, Bob Massey, who was, did, stand up to them just to say hi, who did so much of this work around South African divestment a generation ago, and so was the very first person that we turned to as we tried to launch this fossil fuel divestment fight, and his advice and help has been crucial. If you really need him as governor for the next 4 years, you're allowed to have him, but after that, we need him back as kind of activist leader. I guess 8 years, I don't know however long you're allowed to be governor, but the logic always was that this was the way to demonstrate to everyone that the fossil fuel industry was a rogue industry. That if you understood what it was that they were doing, that their business plan called for digging up 5 or 6 times as much carbon as any scientist says we safely could, if the minute that you realized that, then you would realize why it was not morally okay to be invested in them. And you begin to understand why it was probably financially stupid as well. That argument has grown in power over the years. We're now at the point where about $6 trillion worth of endowments and portfolios have been divested. You're an economist, so $6 trillion may be a more meaningful figure to you than to me. I don't really, it's just a very large sum of money. But the last 3 months has been this crescendo of this. In fact, in November, Norway, which their sovereign wealth fund, which is literally the biggest pool of money on the planet, all their retirements, they divested from fossil fuel. That was particularly significant because Norway made its money in the oil industry, in North Sea oil, okay? So what they basically said was, we're cashing in our winnings from the fossil fuel casino, and we're going to go find a different casino to play in because we think this one is now rigged against this. That was very good, but of course, the world is kind of used to Scandinavia behaving correctly, so people discount it a little bit. A couple of weeks after that, the World Bank announced that beginning in 2019, it would no longer be lending money to anybody doing oil and gas extraction anywhere around the world. That was the work of a decade of amazing activism. And then came this news from New York, which in some ways is the most electrifying of all, because, New York is the absolute dead center of the financial community. It's almost by definition the smart money, This is at the center of things. And it's also a place that's felt very strongly the sting of climate change. I mean, Hurricane Sandy was as scary a moment as really we've had in this whole thing. The picture of the world's greatest city tottering, white caps on Avenue A, water pouring into the subway system at South Ferry, Red Hook turned into Venice for the day, that kind of thing. Those are such powerful, lingering images. So it was amazing to have the mayor stand up and say, we're cutting our ties with this industry and we're suing them. And what was most powerful about it, I think, was that, New York, for all its, you can say a lot of things about New Yorkers, but, chumps they are not. Unwilling to play the sucker ever, And that was sort of what the mayor said. People have been saying we can engage with this industry and try and get something done and get them to change their spots and stuff. That hasn't worked at all, so we're done with it, We're cutting ties, we're going to court. The head of the teachers union, a lot of whose money this was, pointed out that other people have tried to sue the oil industry before. The tiny Alaskan city of Kivalina, the town of Kivalina, 300 and some people whose town has been basically washed away as the ocean. They tried to sue the Marshall Islands, which has 40,000 people or something in the South Pacific. They tried to sue. The guy said, the oil industry was able to squash those guys. Let them try to squash New York, So now we need everybody backing, everybody in the same corner that we can get. Within 2 days, there was a resolution in the city council in Los Angeles saying, to get Los Angeles to sue the oil companies as well. We expect, we hope, we're working extremely hard to get San Francisco, which will vote on January 24th, to divest from fossil fuels. This fight is on in a new way. And this is a fight that Donald Trump can't get in the way of, okay? This doesn't have anything to do with Washington or the federal government or Scott Pruitt or anybody else. This is a fight we can bring in our own places, and that's the fight we have to bring now, because we're not going to do it in Washington. And these guys are vulnerable. They're incredibly rich, incredibly powerful, but they've behaved with incredible irresponsibility, and irresponsibility is the kindest word you could think of to describe what they've done, and hence they are extremely vulnerable, and we've got to be on the charge all the time, every place, including Massachusetts. Boy, it'd be nice to finally get the state of Massachusetts to divest its sanctions. And so many thanks to the people working on college divestment here too. Lost on no one that UMass was the first college system to fully divest from fossil fuel. Very glad to see Brandeis in the House working hard. Harvard is going to be the last. They're going to be dragged kicking and screaming over the thing. You'll be able to tell the day that we've finally won this battle, because the day after that will be the day that Harvard decides it wants to divest too. But we'll keep fighting, we'll keep pushing, no question.
Absolutely. Do you want to just add that little anecdote about the Empire State Building?
I was telling people before that when we were at the press conference with the mayor, Naomi Klein came down from Toronto and I came down from Vermont to join de Blasio. So, we're saying nice things about it, which is what we were happy to do it. And I said, whenever I go to New York, I always look up to see what color the Empire State Building is, because there's always, and what they should do tonight is they should light it up green for the money that you're saving New York retirees, Mr. Mayor, and green for the planet you're helping save. And just this once, it'll be worth the carbon, to do it. And I could see him taking notes over as he was doing it. I was driving back home and I stopped to get gas at 7 o'clock, and someone emailed me a picture of the Empire State Building lit up bright green that evening. I suddenly understood why people want to be mayors of places and all that stuff. That's pretty cool. You just call up and they change the color of the Empire State Building.
So I want to stick on this theme of local and state action in light of what's going on in the federal government and sort of our need to change strategy. And the first question I have is about Massachusetts and our Republican governor, Charlie Baker. So I think, as you know, and you were, I know you came to the State House during the campaign. We've been running this Stand Up Charlie campaign, trying to get the governor to sign an executive order banning all new fossil fuel infrastructure in the state. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how to approach Republican leadership, Republican governors in states like ours, where the population is clearly strongly behind aggressive climate action, and also red states more generally. Sort of what's the strategy? How do we win with these Republicans in office?
So I don't know the answer to that in really Massachusetts or place else. I think actually that that the best you can ever hope to do is kind of get grudging, slow, bit by bit action with people kind of dragging their heels. That's been the history of what any Republicans willing to do anything on this, that's been the history of it. And that's unfortunately not any good at the moment. We actually need somehow to get moving fast enough, which may mean among other things, replacing the governors. You get someone who goes at some speed. And I got to say, it's not just Republicans who need this message. I mean, you've got a Democratic mayor in the city of Boston. You need him blocking pipelines and, helping out in serious the number of politicians who are really doing all that they can, working at maximum effort, is pretty small. We're a little spoiled in Vermont because, Mr. Sanders just seems to be willing to, do what to just sort of go all out whenever we, all in on anything and not worry about it. But there aren't enough of those people, and we need more of them. When you're in a situation like that, when you're doing all the right things. I mean, the Stand Up Charlie campaign is terrific, and it's quite, it's possible if you build big enough activism to make it impossible for people not to do the right thing. We were saying before, and I think this really applies in Massachusetts, one of the biggest problems and one of the ways to get things across, this is a little technical but super important. One of the things that sort of moderate centrist politicians of all kinds have tried to get away with and successfully have gotten away with over the years is arguing that natural gas, the thing that they mostly want to put through these pipelines, is better and cleaner than other forms of energy. It would be nice if that were true, but the science shows that it is not. And I've written a ton about this over the years. What we've learned over the last decade is because the fact that methane, when it leaks straight into the atmosphere, traps immense amounts of heat, that converting things to natural gas is no better than burning coal. And if you could somehow figure out a way to push that into the conversation at every turn, it would make it harder for people to continue doing the thing we're doing at the moment, which is pretending that we're making progress when we aren't. That's, if there's one kind of technical thing to get across, that's it. Natural gas, methane, is as dangerous as burning coal.
Hear, hear. So, since you've mentioned Bernie Sanders,
Talking about Bernie Sanders, I have a question about your own involvement with the campaign, and then of course after the Sanders campaign for the Democratic nomination ended, you were a key person involved in writing the Democratic Party platform. 2 days ago, there was a report on Politico detailing continued divisions within the DNC, discussing the depth of its dysfunction. I'm sort of curious about how you see the party now. What are your thoughts about what needs to happen?
So
where are you at in terms of what's going on with the Democratic Party?
I'm the wrong person to ask in a way. Someone the other night asked me, I was talking someplace, and someone said, "Are you even a Democrat?" And I said, "I'm not 100% sure. I can't remember when I registered last, if I'm registered as an independent or a Democrat. And I've never really done much, electoral campaigning and work has never been our focus at 350 or my focus. Our basic thesis is we're better pushing from the outside than the in, And I'm sort of engaged in it all by accident. My friend and neighbor, Bernie, called me up at the beginning of his campaign and said, "I'm going to run for president. Would you come up and introduce me at the rally we're going to have to introduce me?" And I said, "Okay, I'll come," because he's great, because he's, when we started the fight against the Keystone Pipeline and nobody else in Washington would give us the time of day, not anyone, Bernie turned over his office to us, gave us an assistant to go to, one of his aides to go to work with. So of course I said yes. It was a beautiful spring day in Burlington. The three people introducing Bernie as he announced his bid for president were me and Ben and Jerry. And I think all three of us anyway, and maybe even Bernie thought that perhaps the 5,000 Vermonters who came out that day to watch him announce might be the biggest crowd he would draw in the course of his campaign. It's hard to remember now that he, 6 weeks later, he said, "Will you come down to Boston and introduce me? I'm speaking at the convention center." And I introduced me at the convention center to like 38,000 screaming people, all of whom were not only, I mean, it was like going to, remember that like Rocky Horror Picture Show? Remember that? Everybody knew all the lines already to the whole thing. You know, they're like shouting them back at him as he's doing it. It was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. And I take great solace. I mean, the high point for me in many ways of the whole campaign was in one of those early debates when someone said, "What's the most important problem in the world?" And without hesitation, without even thinking about it, he said, "Well, obviously climate change," which obviously it is, but it's obviously not the thing that any other American politician has ever said in answer to that question. It's not even the thing he cares about the most, you know. Obviously inequality and whatever is his main thing, but he understands the fix that we're in. So when he asked me to go work on the platform committee, I did that. But then, you know, when I went out and worked diligently for Hillary Clinton in the fall, because I had some idea who this guy Trump was. I didn't quite understand exactly what a maniac he would turn out to be, but you know, whatever. Look, you know, who knows if like the official structure of the Democratic Party is going to get it together or not? I don't really know, but I'm not. That's not doesn't strike me as the main thing at the moment. The exciting thing is all over the country, all kinds of people have decided that they're running for office. And they're doing an amazing job. And I think part of it is that people looked at Bernie's campaign and said, well, look, this guy is not charismatic in the normal sense of the word, and he says exactly what he feels, and yet he's by far the most popular politician in America when we look at the polling. There's no reason I can't be state senator or, you know, town council member or whatever else, and I think that that's really great. I'm working to finish a book at the moment because I want to spend as much of 2018 as possible just out on the road helping people in all those local races and in all those places that we can, because I think that we need that kind of small d democratic renewal here. Otherwise, you know, I mean, look, if we ever took for granted the kind of stability and permanence of our democracy and the kind of arrangements we all grew up with, the last year should have served to disabuse us of that notion. Take nothing for granted at this point, except that we need to fight and fight really hard on all fronts.
So that brings me to the question of what some people have called sort of climatizing elections. In other words, putting the climate into the center of elections, which has proven to be very hard. I mean, Tom Steyer tried it here some years ago. You know, it's becoming easier, but I'm just wondering sort of what your thoughts are about how to make that happen in 2018 and then again, of course, in 2020.
If we build strong movements, then by definition, these questions will be important and a big part of the mix. If we build strong movements and if we build them around stopping pipelines and around you know, divesting and around all, then these questions will absolutely be part of the mix. There's no way to have big, strong, provocative movements that are out in the streets all the time and not have them be part of the fight. And, you know, they became big parts of the fight in certain ways in the last go-around, certainly in the primaries. You know, they were important and people needed to take strong positions, and they will next time too.
So this is a question about movement building. Some years ago, 350.org took a major turn toward climate justice, embracing an agenda that was more broad-based, aligned with groups fighting environmental and social injustice, and more intersectional, to use the current terminology approach. Now, I sometimes sometimes hear the argument that climate is the most important issue and that we should stay focused on climate rather than getting our energies diluted in a variety of other struggles, worthy as they may be. There's obviously a strong moral argument to be made for climate justice, and I'm sure you'll make it. But is there also a pragmatic one? What do you say to people who are inclined to be more narrowly climate-centric?
Well, you know,
You've heard that question too many times.
in any fight, a good thing to have in a fight is people who have your back, and people are more inclined to have your back if you had theirs, That's how fights work, And that's what this is. This is a fight. There's not, I would disabused myself many years ago of the notion that there was going to be an easy, rational end to this climate stuff. There should have been. This shouldn't have to be a fight at all. It shouldn't be a political question at all. In the end, it's a question of physics and chemistry, right? That's the problem here. And in any really rational polity, that's what we'd be talking about, and everybody would be figuring out some solution to it and going to work on it. But that hasn't happened at all, and the reason it hasn't happened is because the fossil fuel industry is incredibly strong, and the fossil fuel industry bought one of our political parties, and it terrified the other one. And so we haven't had any real action, and the reason we've built a movement is to have something strong enough to stand up to the power of the fossil fuel industry. So in purely pragmatic terms, it's been great to have as many people as possible on board in that fight. But it's also because, why do we fight? What's the point of fighting against, fighting for a planet that works? It's because we care about, all of us care about each other, That's the point in the end. And so of course we worry about our friends and neighbors who are getting deported or who are, being beaten up by the police or whatever else it is. That's what a community is about, and that's what we're fighting for in the end. This is a fight of pretty much all of us against the fossil fuel industry. And they are the most powerful representative, the most perfect representative of the powers that be in our society. And so, of course, it makes sense that I think that it branches out in all kinds of ways.
So I want to pick up on that point about this industry to ask you a question about U.S. elites more generally, business elites particularly, but business and wealthy. As you well know, social change in the U.S. generally doesn't happen unless there is a split among elites. Usually one segment of business is won over to a cause, and it's often big business. Examples from recent decades include the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the LGBTQ movement, for example. On all of those, a big segment of business sort of moved eventually to ally with the social movement. Now, various parts of our movement have been working to effect this kind of split for a long time, from insider groups like Ceres, which of course Bob Massey ran for quite a while, to groups working on investment, to the fight with the banks to stop pipeline funding. So I'm wondering if you could speak about these efforts to split business on the one hand, how you think they're going, and just one piece of this that has always kind of puzzled me, which is that the destabilization of our climate is disastrous for business. And why is it that so much of American business particularly has been so passive in terms of standing up to the fossil
So what
fuel
do you
industry?
think? What's your sense of that?
Well, I think they have a parochial kind of view about what their legitimate what the legitimate areas that they can work on are. Or at least this is what sort of business people I've talked to say. And I think for many companies this feels a bridge too far. And it's kind of sticking their necks out in a way that feels uncomfortable. Also now, given that the issue is so polarizing, it's been hard for them. And I think they also had a misplaced kind of faith that eventually we'd get this right and the worst wasn't going to happen. But
that seems all correct to me, as well as the fact that there's this sort of now pervasive short-termism of all thinking in the corporate world is a huge problem. So I think what happens is, I mean, here's the problem. Basically, we've got much of the rest of the Fortune 500 that isn't the fossil fuel industry rhetorically on side about climate change, right? They like, it's a problem and we're going to put a lot of solar panels on the roof of all our stores and we're going to use natural gas in our delivery trucks, and that's great. The problem is what we need them to do, what we need the Walmarts and Apples and all those people doing, is unleashing their lobbying power in DC and in state governments on this issue and making the basic policy changes, not the daily operational changes, which are nice but aren't going to add up in time. I think the reasons they don't are what you say, some of the things you say, and also just that they remain so focused on their own short-term, very short-term interests, sort of thinking quarter by quarter, that there's always something that they care more about having their lobbyists do, finding some new sales tax exemption or whatever it is that they're at the moment trying to do. And as a result, the only people whose lobbyists are working full-time on climate change work for the fossil fuel industry, and that's why they're so powerful. No one really has gotten in their face. And that's one of the things we really need to keep insisting on. And it's one of the reasons that these kind of divestment fights are important, because they're a way of saying the stuff that's happening so far, the changes that the fossil fuel industry is talking about are so minor as to be meaningless. We're trying now to separate the sheep from the goats in a real way. And I don't know whether it'll work, but that's the issue. We don't need the CEOs talking, going to Paris and talking about how they're going to use less carbon. That's helpful, but around the margins. We need them going to Washington in the trenches and fighting on the other side from the Exxons and whoever, and they haven't been willing to do that so far.
yeah, so clearly, we've been putting a lot of pressure on the banks who are funding pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure. Are there other industries that you see as particularly ripe for pressure now that people should start to be really ramping up?
Insurance. These guys have more money than anybody, and they understand the problem in a way that no one else does. And in fact, it's really in their, the insurance industry is one of, if not the biggest in dollar terms industries on the planet, okay? It's also one of the most crucial. The actuarial table was one of the greatest inventions of the human imagination. By allowing people to make confident predictions about the future, it allowed people to hedge risk in a way that allowed everything else in our economy and to do what it was going to do, right? No one would make investments on any scale if you couldn't in some way hedge risk and predict what was coming. The only problem with the actuarial table as a technology is it is completely dependent on the world in the future working more or less the way the world has worked in the past. And if that is no longer true, then the actuarial table and hence the insurance industry becomes a more and more marginal and difficult operation, and everything that stems from that becomes, you just add huge amounts of friction and cost to the system. So they're the obvious, one of the obvious players, and in Europe they've been pretty good about all of this. One of the biggest insurance companies in the world, AXA, the biggest French insurance company, divested entirely from fossil fuels in November and announced that they were no longer going to be funding pipelines of any kind or things. We need that spreading and spreading rapidly.
Just one or two more, and then we're going to open it up. The literary critic Frederick Jameson famously said, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." If
mean, I don't have, you're a great economist and you have a stronger sense of all this than me. I will say merely that I don't think that, I doubt that in the time that we have, the sort of entire replacement of our economic system with some other system that we haven't thought of yet or something is going to happen in a way that rescues us. Okay? I think that we're going to be dealing with, to some degree, a system whose features we will recognize. Markets where, you know, people exchange money for goods and things like that. Therefore, the question is, how do we do that in a way that's the least destructive way possible? Clearly, one of the things we have to do is regulate and bring to heel the players in those markets. The experiment with letting them do whatever they want, which is, you know, we've been doing for a long time and that Trump has taken to a new level, is clearly disastrous and stupid. I think the more deep answer to this has less to do with ideology and more to do with scale. And I think that one of the most subversive things that we could do right now is convert as much of the planet as quickly as possible to renewable energy that comes from close to home. That strikes me as really important in that at the moment, people with the richest people in the world are largely those who happen to live atop deposits of coal and gas and oil, and they use the wealth they've accumulated to game the system. And anyway, it's a highly centralized system anyhow. Sun and wind are ubiquitous, diffuse, but ubiquitous. And that means that if we take that seriously, everybody living wherever they are will be, for one of the most important commodities on which they depend, much more self-reliant, or their communities will be much more self-reliant. We won't be shipping money around in the same ways, and we won't be making people like the Koch brothers as infinitely powerful as they are at the moment. It doesn't upend everything all at once, but it strikes me as deeply corrosive to the current way of doing things. And since we need to do it anyway in order to deal with the incredible environmental fix that we're in, I'm hopeful that it will have big knock-on effects in terms of undermining much of the system that we've become accustomed to. But you're an economist, and you may have a better idea than that of what we should do.
Well, I'm going to stick on this theme of local.
Yes.
And this will be my last question. Of course, in your wonderful book, Deep Economy, you talk about a local economy. And that's a theme that is very key to your very first novel, Radio Free Vermont. For those of you who haven't read it, I recommend it highly. It's an engrossing action story that revisits themes from some of your previous nonfiction. So I'm curious why, after writing, and it was very hard for me to exactly count, I think about at least 20 nonfiction books, maybe more, you turned to novel writing. And you also mentioned that you're writing a new book, so please tell us what that is.
Well, the new book's deeply depressing tone, so the reprieve was short-lived. I wrote one funny novel in the middle, and happily all the reviewers thought it was funny, and that was one of the reasons. I wrote it for years because I was homesick and just wanted to think about home while I was endlessly on the road organizing, and that was a good way to do it. I wasn't at all, never really thought I'd publish it, but then in Trump time, it seemed like the last thing we needed last year was a sort of depressing book about the end of the world, and that perhaps, I felt like the entire country had kind of taken a dose of reverse Prozac. We were all sort of anxious and sad all the time, So it'd be good to, if I was going to publish something funny, that would be the year to do it. And so I did. But it does, you're right, one of the many ways in which it connects a little bit with, my other work is that it's in large part a love letter to not just Vermont, but to the resistance, a kind of mash note to this resistance that I've been a part of for a decade, and it has burgeoned so beautifully in the last year, But it also is a little bit about localism. best exemplified, it must be said, that several of the themes that vices that dominate my life are prominent in the book. There's one of the maybe the only cross-country ski chase scene in American literature, and it's also a pretty beer-soaked book. Okay, Vermont has more breweries per capita than any place on planet Earth. And I mean, if you're drinking stuff that comes from more than 500 yards away, you're doing it wrong, in Vermont. But it's a story that I've always, I wrote some of the first writing about beer 30 years ago. First big piece for a national magazine about what we then called microbreweries. And the reason in part was because I liked the taste of it, but the other reason was because this was actually the commodity with which the fight against sort of corporate homogenization of everything really began. In the 1970s in Britain, there was this thing called the Campaign for Real Ale, and it became a huge political force and saved small breweries in the UK, and then it crossed the pond. And in 1980, we were down to about 20 breweries in this country, and 97% of the beer are brewed by 3 of them, and now I think there's 5,800 breweries or something in America. It is undeniable that the planet is going to hell, or at least a place of a similar temperature, but it's also completely undeniable, and we have to be frank and honest at all times, that there are much better things to put in your mouth now than there were 30 years ago. And so from that I take some solace, That's what happens when you have local economies of all kinds. Suddenly you get good beer to drink, among other things. And so it saves one from having to be entirely sad all the time.
So here's to liquid bread, as they call it, and to Bill McKibben.
And to Juliet Schor.
Stay here. And I'm going to take one of them. You two stay here. Share it.
We have time for a little bit of Q&A. I realize like 80% of you are sort of trapped, maybe in a queue and unable to get out, but we actually have a microphone that we'll have down here for people who ask questions. If that's impossible, we can try, we don't have a portable mic, but we can try to repeat some of the questions there. So if you can come up, if you're able to be accessible, is there anybody who has a question that can come to a mic? You want to come forward? You want to come forward? Since you're on an aisle, and here. And if you could come on down. Just right over here by that mic. First, I should tell you that that book, Radio Free Vermont, and several other of Bill's books are on sale. Let's hear it for our local independent bookstore, paperback, paperback. John and Clarissa are out there in that whole entrance area, so they'd be happy to talk to you and sell you a book.
So you were talking about how we need to act fast before climate change really just goes down the road. But what is the main issue that people should address? I mean, there's like air pollution, ocean acidification, plastic pollution, all these things. Where should the force be mainly directed? What would make the most difference?
That is a good question and well put. And the answer is, from my point of view, I mean, we face huge numbers of environmental challenges all over the world. We're triaging a bunch of them because climate change is the overwhelming reality that just will render everything else moot. And the key here, there are many things that we can do to fight it that involve changing agriculture, that involved, but the number one thing we've got to do is stop using fossil fuel. That means huge efforts at efficiency and conservation and the rapid transition to renewable energy. That's job 1 and 2. And the ways we do it, I mean, we're launching this big fossil-free fast campaign. That's what's going to happen on January 31st at this thing that Bernie's kicking off in DC that a bunch of us will be talking at. The 3 sort of big bodies of work were these efforts to get cities and towns across America to promise to go 100% renewable and fast. The effort to block all new fossil fuel infrastructure wherever it shows up. And the effort to cut off the money through divestment, through pressuring banks, everything else that supports the fossil fuel industry. These seem to me the 3 most urgent baskets of work that there are to do. And to the degree, the success is determined by how fast we manage to cut the oil and gas and coal that we're using. That's the single most important measure of progress at this point. Thank you.
Can I add one thing?
Yes,
Yes.
you give your answer.
Thank you. I just want to say that I feel so proud of 350 Massive Better Future Project because those are our priorities here in the state, and we have been working really hard on
So
that.
how do you think we figured out how to do it there myself?
I live in a coastal neighborhood, East Boston, and on the 4th of January we had about 15 feet of water, and that was a record for Boston. So you talk about going local, and people only feel things when it touches them, and something happened in LA or Miami or Tampa doesn't feel as close as something happening right here in our neighborhood. So my question is, how do we best make use of these crises?
That's a really good question too. And that was the pictures out of, Boston and environs were really remarkable. And I think that they did a lot. That evening, the reporter for the Herald called me up in Vermont, and he wanted to do a story about how stupid it was that the mayor had said this was climate change, and wasn't that dumb to blame, it was just the ocean coming in. It's like, no, this is exactly what climate change looks like. It's what every scientist, what do you think is going to happen, Mr. Reporter, if you raise the level of the ocean? Then when a storm comes, it's going to come further in. And Boston and every place else is really beginning to feel this vulnerability. So yeah, to make use of the crisis, one of the things to do is to start pressuring Boston to join in these lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry. Don't let New York and Los Angeles... Exxon's got a lot of money, okay, but they don't have an infinite amount of money. If New York takes $20 billion for Sandy and LA takes, 10 or 15 for the cost of the forest fire stuff, there's not going to be much left for Boston, which is going to need to build seawalls and stuff of its own. Get in on the action soon, okay? One way to keep this in people's minds is, and this is something we've done in other places that really gets inside people's heads sometimes, get people to take paint or tape or whatever else and outline in blue where the water's going to be in Boston when the sea level's gone up 2 feet and 4 feet and 6 feet. City of Boston, as you all know, much of it used to be literally underwater. I mean, this was a city built on landfill. It's not a good, there's no guarantee. In fact, there's pretty much a guarantee that Boston's not going to look like it does now unless we get things very quickly under control and trying to get, this is exactly the moment to be getting that into people's heads, that this is an emergency. It's not, people tend to understand, the polling data shows people understand that we have a problem with climate change and they understand where it's coming from and they're worried about it. People don't always have a sense of how immediate and urgent that is. And so you're absolutely right. When Mother Nature hits us upside the head with the 2x4, as it did on January 4th in Boston, it's a really good idea to make sure everybody understands. I remember what happened in New York the week after Hurricane Sandy hit. Business Week, the biggest business magazine in the country, the headline the next week, the full cover of Business Week simply said, "It's global warming, stupid," you know? If we could keep getting that message across every time this kind of thing happens, we'd be getting somewhere. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm with Fairness Climate Justice. And on January 31st, we're actually presenting to our board of trustees, giving the case for divestment. And when we talk about divestment to students or to like a room full of more conservative investors, we talk about it very differently. And I'm just wondering, from your experience dealing with administrations, what do you think the most strategic way to frame divestment? What's the biggest case that you should push in order to get them to vote yes?
So Juliet could answer this as easily or better than I could, and Bob Massey and others too. But look, I mean, one of the things you need to say is, and you guys are saying this, you already know it, it's not just that fossil fuel is, at this point, an immoral thing to be investing in. It's a really dumb thing to be investing in, too. It's underperformed the rest of the market for 5 or 10 years now. And there's no mystery why, right? I mean, the world is moving on. Every single day, the price of a solar panel gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Every day, Elon Musk builds some more Teslas. Every day, we put up some more windmills. Every day, that means that those things are undercutting the business model for the fossil fuel industry. That's why they're underperforming everybody else, okay? And so you need to be saying that. The reason that these guys won't divest, don't want to divest, is simply that it means shaking things up, you know? It's easier to just keep doing what you've always done. The status quo, left to its own devices, inertia is such a powerful force that the status quo just maintains. And they're all, you know, people who are on the boards of things tend to be rich people who tend in our economy to be investment people, financial people. So they have a kind of vested interest in pretending that money is an amoral force that doesn't, you know, shouldn't be held to account. It's important to make the moral arguments, important to make them understand that from this point on, if you're invested in these things, you own a part of the disaster that ensues, okay? If you're willing to make money off of these companies, then you own the Pacific Island that goes underwater. You own the Californian community that burns in a wildfire. You own the future for your student body that has been cut off, wrecked in so many ways by what they're doing. And you own, and this is, I think this is important at universities in particular, okay? One of the things that we've learned over the last 3 years, and it may be the most depressing and salient, and one of the things we've learned over the last 3 years since this divestment fight started, from great investigative reporting, is that the fossil fuel companies knew everything there was to know about climate change 30 years ago, and they systematically lied about it, covered it up, funded 25 years of denial. I mean, we've had this 25-year debate about whether climate change is real or not. At the beginning of that debate, both sides of the debate knew that it was real, okay? Just one of them lied about it. It's been an entirely phony debate. So you need to say to the people who run a college, if you had done this, if I did this in Sociology 101, if I just wrote a paper, then it was not true, and I knew it wasn't true, and I lied, you would kick me out, okay? And you'd be right to kick me out. That's not what we do at an institution that supposedly is about truth and fact and inquiry, you know? So it's time for you to kick out these guys too, okay? We'll see what happens. Tons of places have divested now. There's no longer any room for, no one gets to be any more a kind of pioneer in this. At this point, people are sort of competing to see who the last sucker holding the bag is at the end of the fight, you know?
Just say one point on that, which I think has been really interesting in the last year or so. I'm hearing from more and more universities who are saying, oh, we are no longer investing in fossil fuels. I mean, Harvard said that last year. I was told that about my own university, Boston College, a few days ago. They refused to own up because they're worried about, whatever they're worried about, a lot of silly things, I think. But that's another angle, which is to force them to, get on the record, particularly those where you can figure out. Of course, many of them fail to provide any transparency in terms of what they're doing, but where you can find out that they actually are no longer investing in these companies, make them own it.
Great. We are entering the speed dating round of the question and answer. Lodi will be the last question, but so I wonder if you could ask 2 questions and pithy short answers, and if you could speak more closely into that mic too.
Twitter, it's extremely important.
How many of you follow Bill on Twitter?
Okay,
the rest of you, please.
It's a daily diet of depressing factoids about the world. So.
True, but you will know everything there is to know about what's going on with climate change if you do follow him.
My name is Jeff. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, as you can see. I'd like to suggest that there's another institution that's worthy of divestment focus. That is, the U.S. military has the largest carbon footprint of any organization in the world. And yet, the military industrial complex, if you will, has such a grasp on our politicians by virtue of the way they spread their money around in terms of electoral districts. We'd like to see a major divestment of our military expenses. And I'd like to know if you have any ideas about how we could best address that issue, working in conjunction with other organizations like 350 and whatnot.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I don't know the exact answer to it, but I do know that this is an important part of this fight. One of the ways to think about the military dimension of this, okay, is that for the last 50 years, one of the biggest reasons that we've had such an oversized military is precisely because we need to protect the lines of supply to our fossil fuel industry. And one of the many good things that will happen if we move aggressively in the direction of renewable energy is that source of demand for military protection will begin to disappear. And it's no accident where we've fought the wars that we've fought, in recent years. And so I think that that's one of the places where this overlaps really powerfully and effectively. I don't know if there'll ever be a sort of divestment movement of quite the same kind around sort of military stocks or not. It's extremely difficult to build up these kind of things, and there have been a number of places where people have tried to do divestment from different things. And really, after the apartheid movement, the fossil fuel one is the first one that's kind of gained quite this sort of level of things, partly because it's able to focus very specifically on a list of companies with their fossil fuel reserves. And that may be one of the things that, it's hard to do across a very broad array of things. But it's definitely something worth trying and thinking about. And if you get it going, then I bet people will jump in and help. And we can provide some advice about ways to get it going, because we've learned some lessons along the way. Many of the lessons we took, we learned from watching and studying about the fight over apartheid. And the first person that we turned to, or one of the first around the world, was Desmond Tutu, because he was one of the few sort of really surviving luminaries of that fight. And he was crucial in getting the fossil fuel divestment movement off the ground. He said, this is the human rights issue of our time, as apartheid was a generation ago, and so we need to bring back this tactic. And that's been extremely helpful. So thinking about it in those terms may be useful to you too. Thank you.
bit about your call to people to be involved in the 2018 elections. And, you know, I guess just quickly, now is an opportunity, February, there's Democratic caucuses all across Massachusetts where people could run to be delegates and have a part in the nomination process. And so I just want to ask you, one of the things that I've come across in the last few months is the data that environmentalists don't vote at the same levels as other issue-motivated voters. And so I'm just wondering, what do you think the best pitch is to, get us off the couch and really have a hand in our political future?
So those are all good questions. I don't think people's understanding of who environmentalists are, I think it's now way out of date. The data we see from around the country indicates that the two groups who are most concerned about climate change in America are African American voters and Latino American voters. And by quite large percentages, they're the people who worry most about climate change and are most outspoken about it. And yet when people talk about environmentalists, they rarely get sort of top billing. That's what we were talking about before, about this need for kind of broad partnerships and coalitions, and that's really key. And I'm really glad to see people livened up by campaigns of all kinds. And just remember that it's both an inside and an outside game, I remember when, I didn't tell you the full story about what I said when Bernie called up to say if I'd come introduce him. He said, I'm running for president, will you come, endorse me? I said, yes, I will, as long as you understand that you're almost guaranteed that 6 months after you're elected president, I'll be like sitting in outside your door to demand that you go faster. And to his credit, Bernie said, well, I wouldn't have it any other way, So remember that it takes all these different kinds of action, but in years that end in an even number, elections are a big part of the agenda that we need to fight on.
Keep it short and sweet. My question was, maybe in the U.S., maybe globally, are there any people or groups that you look at and think, wow, that's amazing, that's really inspiring? Bonus points if we don't know them, right?
Bonus points of what? Say again, bonus?
Sorry, we don't know about them.
There's unbelievable numbers of groups doing just amazing things every place around the world. Let me say that maybe the most impressive and beautiful and powerful flowering of the environmental movement around the world in the last 5 years has been the rise of indigenous communities in this work everywhere. Standing Rock was completely great. It was so much fun to be there, but it didn't surprise me a bit because all the people who were working hard on it many of them were people that we've been working hard with on Keystone, which was sort of the prerequisite to that, and who've been working hard on the tar sands fight even before Keystone became a big part of it. You have people like Dallas Goldtooth, who will be at this thing we're doing on January 31st, or Winona LaDuke, there's just an endless list of people who are doing amazing work, not just in the United States. All around the world, native peoples are punching way, way, way above their weight in place after place after place. And it's not just that partly it's just strategic. In this country, we exiled all the people who were here originally to barren parts of the continent that we thought were worthless, and it turns out that they're in fact sitting on top of large deposits of fossil fuel or astride the pipeline routes that we need to get at it. So now they have some strategic ability to get in the way. That's part of it. But more, it's the kind of moral power, and it's a very important moment, that the oldest wisdom traditions on the planet, are now in perfect sync, more or less, with the newest wisdom traditions on the planet. That is, the vision coming out of the sweat lodge and the vision emerging from the supercomputer analyzing the latest satellite data are pretty much exactly the same. That's a moment of great power and great leverage, and that's one of the reasons that I have some real hope about the next few years as we get to the absolute heart and core of this battle, which is the next 5 or 10 years, to have the deepest human cultures left on this earth fully engaged in this fight gives me great comfort anyway.
You talked about the upcoming 2018 elections, and it seems to me that November 6th may be the most important day of 2018. I would think that for climate, for the sake of the climate, getting the Senate and the House of Representatives flipped around would be incredibly important. I'm wondering whether you think that's the most important thing. I mean,
So I think it's
a particular fossil fuel infrastructure issue, but just do that and then after November 6th go back to the fighting.
I think it's very important, okay, and it will be very helpful, but mostly it's going to be helpful in playing defense. It's not, even if the Democrats end up with majorities in the House and Senate, we're not going to pass great climate legislation that gets signed by the president and changes the game. That's not going to happen. We can play more effective defense if we have control of some of those, some of the levers of power in Washington. But remember, we had control of most of the levers of power during the Obama administration, and we didn't really make much progress on climate issues, okay? It waits on building movements that can, the real prize for all activists on all sides all the time is to control the zeitgeist. That's what we fight for more than anything else. And when we win control of the zeitgeist, when it becomes clear and obvious what should be, then much of the rest falls in line. So we can affect the zeitgeist on November 6th in those elections, and we should, and that's important. We can also affect the zeitgeist in powerful ways by organizing at the state and local level, by electing important state and local offices, but just as important, by divesting cities and states, by blocking pipelines, by doing all the things that force us to over and over again make the set of arguments that we need to make until it is entirely clear to everyone in the country what direction we're going in, what will happen, what's the obvious, natural, common sense place to go. That's what changing the zeitgeist means, and it means that every action everybody takes really helps. So even if on January 31st people go to the Brandeis trustees and the Brandeis trustees say, no, you know what, we can't do this, we're not going to do it. It doesn't mean that people's efforts were for nothing at Brandeis. The fact that they were there raising the issue on campus every day, day after day after day, is a big part of this process at chipping away at what seems normal now and replacing it with has to seem normal in the days to come. So that's, don't worry, I'll be out campaigning hard, and everybody else that I know will too, as the fall goes along. But that's just part of the story. Movement building is the key here, and that's why 350 Massachusetts and what Juliet does every day and what Craig does and what all of you do every day is so important. That's at the root always of change. Important as it is to have great people in office, our job is not to look to great people in office to be our saviors. We build movements that change the course, the way that history runs, and if we build those movements, then the leaders to take advantage of those changes in the zeitgeist will be there, and we'll get done what needs done.
campaigns, why no is not enough, and municipal aggregation, taking the power of our monthly electric bills out of the fossil fuel industry and shifting them to renewables to municipal contracts.
So, Lori, first of all, just to say enormous thanks to you for a lifetime of work on this. You've been working on this longer than anybody I know. Second, of course, in many ways, I'm precisely the wrong person to ask that question to, because what I really like doing is having fights, and and I'm always in a bad mood and hating the bad guys and working on stuff. But I think your instincts are, as usual, very correct, and I think there's enormous possibility in the larger sense for a real shift in that direction. Community choice energy is a good example. One of the really encouraging things is this: when the polling guys ask Americans, they don't just poll people about political candidates. There's pretty robust polling about lots of different topics. Do you favor, not favor, such and such and such? The thing that polls best in America across Republicans, Democrats, and independents, by far, the thing that gets the highest marks is solar panels. Everybody loves them at about an 85% rate. Every political persuasion is behind solar, sometimes for different reasons, okay? I think that there's a kind of libertarian, now I have solar panels on my roof and I need not ever speak to anyone ever again, I'm cut off successfully from the rest of the planet. Do not bother me, as opposed to the kind of now I'm part of the grid with my neighbors and we are sharing our electrons with each other, whatever. I'm more of the second. I like the idea that the sun that falls on my roof, cools the beer of my neighbor before the Red Sox game. That makes me happy. But different strokes for different folks, And so this rise of renewables is a really, really powerful thing. And it will happen. And it will happen fast enough to matter if we get the fossil fuel industry out of the way of it. So every tactic, and the community choice energy is a good one, every tactic that weakens the hold of the fossil fuel industry and its allies on our energy system is extraordinarily useful, because our ally all the time is this rise of renewable energy. The fact that it's cheaper with each passing week is an enormous threat. And if we're able, even for a few more years, to hold off the fossil fuel industry, to keep them from building new pipelines, to keep them from facts on the ground that will last 40 or 50 years into the future, every time we're able to slow them down, it makes it that much easier for that new future that very much wants to be born to be born. So thank you for your work, and thank everybody for your work. One of the problems with climate change is because it's time limited, we actually don't know how it's going to come out. We can't guarantee that we're going to win. The fact that the Arctic is melted is a pretty sobering fact, okay? The biggest physical features of our planet are in flux. That's not good, okay? But by the same token, the fact that we don't know exactly how it's going to come out should be a source of, if not a certain amount of hope, then at least a certain amount of determination. This is the great unsolved, unknown question that hangs over this planet in the time that we happen to be alive. And so it is our job, even without knowing how it's going to come out, to throw everything we have into the fight to change the odds some. The stakes are so high that if we can change the odds however much we can, then it's well worth the fight. Thank you all so much for being part of it.